Good evening, everyone. If those of you up on the upper level could take your seats, we'll begin. And we wish to begin this evening by acknowledging that UBC is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. This land has long been a place of learning for the Musqueam, who, for thousands of years, have passed on their culture and traditions from generation to generation in the place where we are now gathered. UBC is fortunate to have a close relationship with the Musqueam, and we appreciate the existence of this magnificent campus on their traditional territory. I'm Graham Wynne. I'm a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and I have been a member of the steering committee of a group called the Royal Society of Canada Pacific Chapter, about which I'll say more in just a moment, that has put this session together. But let me just begin by saying a few words about the Royal Society of Canada. The Royal Society of Canada was established in 1883 by the Governor-General of the country, and it was intended to recognize the country's intellectual leaders in order to help them build a better future in Canada and around the world. In the years since 1883, the Royal Society has refined its mandate and now seeks to mobilize its membership to make significant and substantial contributions of knowledge, understanding, and insight through engagement with the larger society of Canada. To further these ends in British Columbia, a few of us have recently initiated the Pacific chapter of the Royal Society of Canada. Our aim is to foster engagement among those who are members of the Royal Society and to help promote public understanding by examining and discussing issues of crucial importance to citizens of this province. Hence this, our inaugural forum on questions surrounding the decision to proceed with construction of the Site C Dam on the Peace River. We're gratified at the interest in this event, reflected in your attendance here this evening, and we look forward to planning 2 or 3 similar events to take place later this year and next, and we hope that those may be of interest to many of you. We, members of the Royal Society Pacific Chapter, are also extremely grateful for the support of the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies. Before I turn to introduce a current fellow of the Peter Wall Institute to carry proceedings forward, I just want to alert you to a forced change in the announced program for this evening. Unfortunately, our second speaker, Dr. Karen Backer, came down with the flu and lost her voice yesterday afternoon, and we have been endeavoring, I think with some success, to fill the gap that created in the program. What we are going to do in place of Karen's attendance and presentation this evening is to screen a video that has been prepared along the lines of the remarks that she intended to make by Rick Hendricks, a member of her research team who compiled the reports on Site C about which Karen was to speak. And Rick has put this video together at relatively short notice and at some long remove from us because he is resident in Canada. I believe that he is listening into the live feed, and he will also take advantage of the Twitter feed to send any such questions as he has for discussion when the speakers have concluded. So this is not quite as advertised, but I hope that we are able to cover the essential topics. And thank you, Rick, for stepping into the breach, if you're listening, and also for staying up rather late in Toronto, which is, of course, 3 hours ahead of us. To recognize our gratefulness to the Peter Wall Institute, I'd like to call on Walter Maridar to say a few words. Walter has worked on clean energy solutions for more than 20 years, and he's done that in both the private sector and universities. Since joining UBC in 2002, Walter has worked with the National Research Council and been a visiting professor at the Fraunhofer Institute for Solar Energy Systems. He leads the Transportation Futures Group at the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, and he tells me that he was in Berlin this morning, just arrived back, doing more of his good work. He has developed industry-led consortia on clean energy technologies, and in 2016, he was recognized as one of Canada's Clean 50. Congratulations. It took me back to the years when I used to play hockey and had a number 30 on my jersey, and I was known as Dirty 30. Clean 50 is a much better appellation. During his current fellowship at the Peter Wall Institute, Walter is exploring the ethical, economic, and social dimensions of advanced transportation systems in a low-carbon economy. So, Walter, thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much, Graham, for that very kind introduction, and thank you to the team for having some remarks prepared for me. That's very handy. Good evening, everyone. It really is a privilege for me to welcome you on behalf of the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies at the University of British Columbia. As Graham said, I'm Walter Merida. I am actually currently the Associate Dean of Research for the Faculty of Applied Science, and I guess part of the reason that our director, Philippe Tortel, asked me to say a few words is that I have been working on some of these issues for a while. So let me tell you a little bit about the Institute. Of all the things that I have done in the last few years, I think being a scholar at the Institute has been definitely the most inspirational and challenging and fun thing I have done. So the Institute provides a platform for world-class scholars to explore innovative research questions in a vibrant, collegial, safe, and as I said, fun atmosphere. Our programs draw together scholars from UBC and around the world to engage in deep and unconstrained research into some of the most profound and challenging questions of our time. And I guess that, as we will hear from some of our guests, the issues surrounding one of the most, if not the most expensive infrastructure project in British Columbia's history are a good illustrations of those challenges. Canada is actually really well positioned, and I can tell you because internationally Canada is well recognized as a world leader in certain areas, and we are very well positioned to become a global leader in climate solutions, while at the same time capturing the significant opportunities for economic growth in a low-carbon economy. However, I really believe that we are at a pivotal moment in our history. The decisions that we make today and in the next few years are going to reverberate well beyond our borders and well beyond our lifetimes. The current dialogue on a national framework for carbon pricing must consider the repercussions of investments that actually support an energy system architecture that is quickly being phased out. And the economic repercussions of those decisions are very significant. Norway, the state of New York, and Ireland just announced that they are divesting from oil and gas. The United Kingdom just announced that they will be phasing out all coal power generation in the next 7 years. That's a very short time. Germany's current bid for a non-permanent seat in the UN Security Council has been presented in the context of the geopolitical stability that their well-coordinated transition to renewable energy might enable. So these are very complex and broad-ranging issues. And at the Institute, we are trying to really find some creative and innovative solutions to some of these challenges. We engage in primary research and also in community outreach and knowledge mobilization through public programs and collaboration with non-academic partners. The activities at the Institute also contribute to the cultural enrichment of UBC and the wider community through regular lecture series and artistic events. Since its founding in 1996, the Institute has created a community of scholars at UBC and all over the world. This forum is one example, and we are very happy to be part of the effort by the Pacific chapter of the Royal Society of Canada. Without further ado, I would now like to introduce you to the MC for this evening, Mr. Charlie Smith. Charlie has been the editor of the Georgia Strait since 2005, and before that he was the paper's news editor. For 7 years, he taught investigative techniques at Kwantlen Polytechnic University, then known as Kwantlen University College, and he worked for 13 years at CBC Radio. In addition, he has researched and reported stories on CBC TV, Global TV, and other media. Charlie, I think, is a very good candidate for emceeing today because he really enjoys public speaking, moderating, and panel discussions. So please help me welcome Charlie Smith.
Thanks, Walter and Graham. It's great to be here, and I have to give credit. I didn't come up with the name of the event, Site C, damned if you do, damned if you don't, but it was very clever. I want to welcome all the people who are watching on Facebook as well as here at the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies. I'm Charlie Smith, editor of the Georgia Strait. The Georgia Strait and the Tyee are the media sponsors. Since Premier John Horgan announced on December 11th that the Site C Dam would be completed, there's been a never-ending debate in this province, and it seems to be intensifying. Tonight, we have with us academics who've thought long and hard about these issues for a very long time, raised by Site C, including future electricity needs, climate change, Indigenous legal rights, water rights, costs to society, and even the pace of change in the electricity market. So, among the experts that we have here tonight is Dr. Gordon Christie, a professor at the Peter A. Allard School of Law at UBC, and he's an authority on Indigenous legal issues. We'll also have a film presentation. But our first speaker I will introduce is economist Mark Jaccard, professor of sustainable energy at the School of Resource and Environmental Management at Simon Fraser University. He was nominated to the Royal Society of Canada in 2008 for his career work on energy and climate policy design and analysis. So please join me in giving Mark a warm welcome to the Peter Wall Institute.
Thanks, Zach, for doing that, and thanks, Charlie. So I was asked to speak, and one of the reasons I was given was that the Royal Society really wants to be at the cutting edge of presenting urgent issues to society, and so Site C, an urgent issue, but there's always a timing issue, and I've been working for the last 3 months completely on something else, and so I'm sorry, but I'm going to give a different talk. It's on the Trans Mountain Pipeline. No, I'm just joking. I saw there was some seriousness and some panic right here. So I tried to remember what the Site C Dam was, and I'll do my best. But if in question period, we can always touch on other issues. So there could be a narrative out there, perhaps some of you, where Site C is just wrong, and it's wrong for all these different reasons, and no amount of new information would change your mind on that. Like, no amount of, it's 10% completed, it's 50% completed, it's 100% completed. You would still say it's wrong, tear it down. And that's fine for someone to hold to that narrative, and that's, I don't try to counter that in any way. But what I would try to do, because a part of that narrative then says, so if a BC government concluded otherwise, then it has to reflect either stupidity or immorality or complicity in some way. It's to demonize the person who made that decision. And personally, I think that would be unfair. And the reason I think it would be unfair is because it's a very difficult decision. And it was maybe it wasn't a difficult decision when Christy Clark took the decision, but I would argue it's a difficult decision when John Horgan took that decision. And you can still disagree with me, but I'm going to give you some of the kind of information that, in keeping with the Royal Society, is not my position. It's me trying to tell you in a few key areas what leading scholars in the world are saying. So I can say with a lot of confidence that what I'm going to be talking about, the 3 points I'm going to make, if I took the 20 leading scholars in the world, every one of them would agree with me on those points. Now, put together 100 leading scholars, I'll get some who will disagree in some aspects. So it's kind of like the climate change science. And that's what I want to say by way of introduction. So, this is very small. Okay. So my background, I'm from Vancouver, did my doctorate in France in an energy, a well-known energy institute. I came back. I was appointed by the Harcourt government as the Utility Commission chair for 5 years. And I've been a long-time opponent of Site C, including even when Rita Johnson, some of you will know about that, ran in an election to try to win, and she made Site C the whole focal point. And at that time, my analysis had shown, she had said we needed to do that for jobs. And so my analysis showed, just a minute, I always keep track of the time here. 45. My analysis showed that way more jobs would be created by energy efficiency. So I even ended up with, in the middle of the election campaign, some headlines in the Vancouver Sun to that effect. But I've been a long-time opponent of Site C, primarily because of mega project challenges, which I won't talk as much about, but they relate not just to the risk of cost overruns, but also how you, taking big bites as a way of investing in new electricity supply, things that we were starting to learn in the 1980s and 90s. Also because British Columbia is a mountainous region where valley bottoms are really valuable. And BC Hydro and Columbia River agreements flooded a lot of valleys already. Glaciers left us some of the valleys flooded, and it makes no sense to flood more, especially as we're learning more about the electricity system and the possibilities with technological change. And then more recently, the last decade or so, thinking more about First Nations issues as I, like others, have become aware of them, probably becoming aware of them more slowly than I should have been, if I think of that in retrospect. There are many uncertainties with Site C. What will be its final cost? What will it cost to cancel it? What are the social and environmental costs that didn't get monetized or put a dollar price on them? And so on. But I'm going to focus on only 3 uncertainties. And so I'm going to try to give you some information about what the thinking is of scholars on this. And I can even refer to different groups of scholars if need be. And because maybe that'll just give you pause to say it was not an easy decision by John Horgan, and I think that would be good for people to understand that. Oh, and by the way, I will say, I have used Site C in my graduate seminar for maybe almost 20 years. In one of the very first classes in that graduate seminar, I say to people, well, first they all have to learn about Site C because some of them aren't from British Columbia and so on, but then I get them other students to help them. And then I say, now make an argument for or against Site C. So they almost always argue against Site C. And then I say, now, I want you to give the best possible arguments on the opposite side of your position. And they can't do it. They give lousy arguments. And then I said, wait a minute, here's a better argument. So because if you're a good, in our case, a good researcher, you should never have a position on something. You should never hold to a hypothesis unless you know the best counter-hypothesis. And they weren't able to do that. And what I'm going to try to do here tonight is challenge you to make sure you know the best alternative evidence to the position you have. That'll make your position stronger, no matter what it is. So the 3 areas are, I heard a lot in the last 2 years that falling costs of wind and solar make the value of Site C lower. So, the cost of Site C, its economic benefit is less if its alternatives are getting cheaper. And I'm going to argue counter to that. I've also heard that anyway, we don't need more electricity in British Columbia. We're using less. The demand is going down. And so we can do it with efficiency and shifting loads and so on. And that's an area where I have done a lot of work. And then finally, will Site C be surplus to need? So people said it'll be surplus to need. And then we say, okay, but maybe if we really go hard on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, will it still be surplus to need? And then the argument is, yes, it'll still be surplus to need. So I'm just going to show you what the Deep Decarbonization Project led by Jeffrey Sachs at Columbia University and the Canadian researchers, what they found. And it's not sacrosanct, but there's a whole bunch of people around the world that critique that research, me being one of them. So, do falling costs of wind and solar erode the value of Site C? Some Site C opponents argue this. But leading researchers find the opposite because of the growing need for what's called dispatchable capacity as we use more non-dispatchable or intermittent wind and solar. So the wind and solar, you can predict a lot about wind and solar, but you can't ramp it up to full use when you need it the most. Whereas other resources, some of them renewable, geothermal, some wood waste, you can at least increase the electricity and sort of get to maximum capacity when you think you'll have the maximum need. But others, like run-of-river hydro, solar and wind, are not like that. So what that means is that we're actually two different products. The electricity that's dispatchable is one kind of product, and the electricity that's non-dispatchable is a different kind of product, and to the system, they have very different values. And ironically, as you get more of the non-dispatchable, the value of the dispatchable goes up. It becomes more and more important. I'll just give you a couple of examples for that. So what I mean by this is, think of this as a 24-hour, yeah, there it is, 24 hours across the day, and the demand is underneath that top line. And so let's say the demand peaks around 6 p.m. Offices are still got lights on, and their systems are running, and industry a little bit, and then a lot of people have just gotten home, turning on lights, heat, whatever. In the past, we had an electricity system where we could pretty well predict what's called the base load production, thermal plants, nuclear plants, even hydro sometimes. And then also we'd have to have different facilities that didn't run as much during the year. They were just there to dispatch on the peak. When we get a system like this, where we always take, so if the wind is producing, there are exceptions, but we'll almost always take that wind, it's like almost free, then that means when we're running the system, we now have two things changing. The top line, which is the demand, which is variable, and the supply from the intermittence, which is variable. So now we need something that can really meet that peak when we need it, even if the blue line disappears at the same time. And so I'll just give you a couple of examples here. One of them is California, and if I'm among California energy people, we always talk about the duck. And the reason is duck. Before I'll put this graph up there, just think of a day in the spring in California with more and more solar on people's rooftops. Then as you get into the late afternoon on a sunny day, suddenly the utility, San Diego Gas and Electric or Southern Cal Edison, there's very little demand for its electricity. And then as the sun goes down and people go home, that shoots up. So they need to provide a lot in a short period of time. And so here's some simulations on that. And this is actually what really happened in 2017, in May 14th, and there's from December. And the reason we call it a duck, well, maybe you can see that in the shape there. And what's going on in the middle, this deep belly, is that as we put more solar panels on people's roofs, this comes down and down. This is the demand, so that's in megawatts. And if you think of this, the British Columbia system is about this much. So they've got hash marks in here because it's a jump. And so what you see is that they have to bring online 13,000 megawatts, about a British Columbia of electricity in a couple of hours or an hour. So that's the idea of why you need dispatchable, why it could be valuable. And electricity experts working around the world now are saying, oh my goodness, you need to pay people a lot of money to have a plant that sits around and is never used, but it's available right at that peak, whether it's batteries or whether it's a natural gas turbine that sits there all year and then runs at that peak time. So you have to pay a lot for that peak time. What does that mean in terms of actual value. Now, this is the graph that I think is the hardest to explain, but my PhD students say that you'll understand this, so, okay. And so it's called value factor. And in fact, if you don't get this, don't worry. That duck you just saw was enough. But basically, the value factor, the average of everybody generating electricity in Texas, this is Texas, is 1. Because 1 stands for the ratio of average revenue, so the average revenue that wind gets, to the average market price for all sources. So if we lumped wind together with all the other sources, the average is itself or over itself, so it's 1. It would just be a line like this. What this shows you is as the percentage of wind increases, the amount of that wind that's able to generate when it's most valuable, the percentage goes down. And I can talk to you in question period about why that is. It just means you're producing more when the wind's blowing in the middle of the night, as you've got more and more wind turbines out there, and you're less and less able to match right onto that peak demand. And so that means that anything that can match on that peak demand, that can be dispatchable to it, its value is going up as wind's value is increasing. So you're going to get more and more money, let's say from that natural gas turbine that's almost never used. It has to make a whole bunch of money at its peak time. If it doesn't make a whole bunch of money, it doesn't pay off the capital costs and all the rest. Site C can produce dispatchable capacity. So that is the essence of the point I was trying to make about how one thing could see, now that's not its cost, but as the cost of wind has been going down per kilowatt hour and solar, that the value you'd get from something dispatchable would go up, because these are complements rather than substitutes, at least for that aspect of dispatchability. Now, the second one, can efficiency and load shifting equal Site C? Now, this is an area where I have done a lot of research over the years. I've turned away from this in the last while. One reason is I used to be a real advocate as I got out with my PhD, and I did a lot of research on energy efficiency, and then I started to learn from other leading scholars around the world in publications and trying to publish in top journals what were the challenges to electricity efficiency, energy efficiency. So the BCUC, in its decision, came up with something that to me was quite shocking. And even in the last few months, I've been circulating that among some of the scholars I know in the United States, in Europe especially. And because what they did is they said, oh, we think that, yes, Site C is this lumpy investment, so it comes in at once, and that is bad economics, right? So bringing something in, big and huge like that, that's a negative for Site C, a big negative. Then they've said, and to make it worse, we don't even need to replace it with anything, because you'll just do enough energy efficiency and load shifting to compensate for all of Site C. So these two graphs are, the top one is the energy. So that's how much energy you produce, and we talk about Site C producing about 5,000 gigawatt hours a year capable, and you see it comes in 2025 and boom. That's bad, right? So that, unless you can sell that for a good price sometimes because of its dispatchability, even outside of British Columbia. But that's another question. Here's the capacity, right? It's about 1,000 megawatts. So a lot of people in the audience know these things now because you've just been seen it a lot. But what they ended up doing is they said, now here's the demand for energy, the blue line, here's the demand for capacity, and look how much demand side management, that's ramping up PowerSmart efficiency programs even more than what they would be providing under BC Hydro's current efforts with PowerSmart. And then some load shifting. So an example of that, so time of use rates would be, and capacity and industrial curtailment, these would be, when I chaired the Utilities Commission, we tried to get a pulp mill or whatever to be able to shut down when there was some kind of crisis, when transmission lines from the Peace River went down or whatever. So to be able to be shut down, they would demand a lot of money off of their rates all year long, every year. So these things are quite expensive. That was my experience, and as I've circulated that with other experts, they've said, and in the literature, it's still those kind of values to try to get that interruptibility. So as I say, this is an area where I've done a fair bit of work on energy efficiency. This is an example of a paper that I and Nick Rivers did. He was my PhD student at the time, and he's now a Canada Research Chair at the University of Ottawa. And just a few lessons from our and other work. Energy efficiency is often more expensive when all full costs and risks are included. Energy efficiency subsidies are often captured, so when there's like $50 to buy an efficient fridge, we find that 50 to 70 to 80% of the people who get the $50 were going to have bought the efficient fridge anyway. That's itself a long story. There's also rebounds, so people will use more of something if it's lower operating costs because of efficiency. And then I already just talked to you about ambitious load shifting programs are really challenging. So now I'm down to my third point. I hope I'm okay in terms of time. Will the sites, so the other thing that I heard was people saying, will Site C be surplus to need? Well, what if we achieve our greenhouse gas targets? What if we really reduce greenhouse gases? And so I alluded to that earlier when I talked about the Deep Decarbonization Project. Former PhD student of mine, Chris Bataille, does all the modeling for Canada. And then he's just mostly working out of Columbia in New York and in Paris with a group there called IDRI. And so we've heard this argument that, we could actually reduce greenhouse gases even without using more electricity. And so, horror of horrors, we would reduce our greenhouse gases and still Site C would be sitting there surplus to need after we completed it. And I don't think the evidence supports that. I mean, the evidence could be, or if you're forecasting that we won't achieve our greenhouse gas reductions and therefore Site C would be surplus. And I think that's a pretty good bet. But if you're going to argue that governments ought to reduce their greenhouse gases and keep pressuring them to do that and have some success, it has real implications for electricity demand, dramatic. And so I've already sort of said that because we'd use some biofuels, but there are limits to that. Hydrogen, usually the way we make hydrogen is with electricity. So there'd be a lot of electricity demand. And the leading research shows a dramatic increase in electricity demand if we're pushing on greenhouse gases. So it really looks like, and I don't blame them, but it looks like the Utilities Commission in its report, you can see it, they rejected the argument that our government will reduce greenhouse gases. They said, we don't trust them, we don't think they'll do it. Therefore, Site C will be surplus to need. So I'm going to give you just a couple of slides here to show that, and then I'm ready to stop. I've been doing a lot of work, and more recently, so my work is on how does Canada achieve its targets. I also model for the United States and for individual regions, California, individual provinces, and we look at different targets. This one here was the 55% reduction by 2050 because that was the Stephen Harper target for a study, and Justin Trudeau hadn't, this is about 2 years ago. Justin Trudeau now says that we want an 80% reduction by 2050. So this was this study about, is win-win possible? Can we achieve our Paris target of 2030, which is a 30% reduction from now? And I and a couple of my research associates did this, and I just wanted to show you, this is just one graph from that study. So you look out, the blue is gasoline, and this is new car sales. So this is the sales in each year. And the gray is pure electric vehicles. The orange is ethanol or some mix of ethanol and gasoline, but the gasoline is calculated out and put in the blue. And the yellow are plug-in hybrid electric and a tiny bit of hydrogen. And we don't know for sure what it'll be, but we do know that the gasoline has to plummet like that to hit these targets. And in fact, it has to do it more rapidly than that. We know that electricity is going to play a big role in transportation, especially in urban settings. Not so much in highway travel, perhaps. We don't know. And so what does that lead to in terms of electricity demand? So remember, this means no more natural gas in buildings using electricity. We already do a lot in British Columbia, 40 to 50%. And then no more gasoline and diesel in transportation, only trace amounts. And then even large industrial applications to get heat, and so on and so forth. So when you look at that, the deep decarbonization study gives you a graph like this. Now let me just explain. So those are the years heading out there, And the blue was the estimate. We have a word here, BAU. It just means business as usual. And it's still a whole bunch of policies in there that are already there, like the carbon tax and so on, to reduce greenhouse gases. But the orange line is and that shows the electricity demand in British Columbia as Vancouver's doing some of its policies and so on to reduce greenhouse gases. The orange line is how much electricity demand if you really hit those targets that we're talking about. And this is with a lot of energy efficiency as well. It's just not solving everything. And that's how you get to the gray line. So the gray is just the orange subtracting the blue. So that's the extra electricity over and above. And so that's this area right here. And by 2025, when Site C is supposed to be finished, that's about 20,000 gigawatt hours or 4 Site Cs. So in summary, the Royal Society of Canada tries to inform the public and policymakers about the findings of leading research. And that means if you are true to that, you may say things that are unpopular sometimes. But I try to be someone who's not afraid of saying things that are unpopular. But I don't do it deliberately. So I do believe that the evidence is still strong enough that the decision in 2013 to start the Site C dam it was an error. I don't think you can find a strong economic argument for it, and I can think of other strong arguments not to doing it, and we'll have other speakers talking about that. As for the 2017 decision, I think that's a really difficult decision. And I think it's good for people to challenge themselves to see why it might be a difficult decision. And not to just say, oh, there are just evil or dumb people out there who just ignore stuff. And so everything, John Horgan had no dilemmas in making that decision. It's just got to be something else. And yet I heard a lot of that, and I have been hearing a lot of that. Maybe Charlie was referring to that. So, and I do note that some of those key arguments by Site C opponents are not consistent with leading research in energy and environment economics. And so I've tried to explain these in this talk, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, our next speaker was going to be, as Graham indicated, Karen Bacher from UBC, a water expert, but she's unable to be here tonight. So instead, we're going to present a film, part of her research team, Rick Hendricks, and we'll probably hear a very different perspective in this presentation. Is it ready now, Zach?
Yeah.
Okay. So, no further ado.
Yep.
We're about to go with this, and then we will hear from another speaker, and then we'll receive questions from the audience. And also don't forget the hashtag AskSiteC, because we will be taking questions over Twitter for people who are watching on Facebook right now. So just let me know when you're ready to go. And in the meantime, I hope you enjoyed Mark Jackard's presentation. It was iconoclastic, which is what he is known for doing from time to time, but at the same time, it was very educational. So are you ready to go, Zach? And this will be Rick Hendricks,
Good evening.
part of a research team that is.
My name is Richard Hendricks.
Okay.
On behalf of my co-researchers, Dr. Karen Bacher and Mr. Philip Raffles, I am presenting some of the key findings of our research conducted through the program on the BC Utilities Commission inquiry respecting Site C. My thanks to the Royal Society, to the Peter Wall Institute, to my co-presenters this evening, Dr. Mark Jackard and Dr. Gordon Christie, and to all of you who have joined us for this discussion. Over an 18-month period, the Program on Water Governance published 6 reports on Site C, and also made 6 technical submissions and 2 presentations to the inquiry conducted by the Commission. The UBC reports were reviewed by independent academic experts, and the submissions were cited by the BCUC frequently during their inquiry into Site C. This evening I will speak to 4 of our reports, and really just the high-level issues in the short time that I have available. This includes economic issues and risks, employment, greenhouse gas emissions, and significant adverse environmental effects. We conducted this research to address issues identified but not thoroughly investigated during the regulatory process for Site C. Economic issues and risks. Load growth is the most important issue in the economic evaluation of Site C. That was our determination from our analyses, and it was also the determination of the Commission. There are many factors that go in that influence and affect a load forecast. Also, to the extent that Site C power is required, its cost should be compared to the least cost combination of alternative supply and demand side resources that can provide reliable service while meeting BC's GHG emission reduction objectives and other objectives in the Clean Energy Act, for example. How those alternatives are compared, however, is an important determining factor in whether or not Site C is economic relative to the alternatives. So first of all, is BC Hydro's demand growth forecasting reliable? We considered this question by looking back at the historical data over the past several decades. And we found that BC Hydro has consistently over-forecast demand in 85% of cases, and that this error increases over time. And you can see this in the graph. Because load has been flat for the past decade, forecast that predicts growing requirements, as each year passes, that forecast becomes less accurate. So actual load growth, we found over the last several decades, has been more consistent with BC Hydro's low load forecasts than its mid-load forecasts. And this graph, just for an explanation, this is the total energy required annually in the province of British Columbia, and these are the years. BC Hydro's current mid-load forecast, so its most recent forecast, the one used by the Commission, is much higher than other jurisdictions. It's 1.2% per year, and you can see the comparisons there with several other jurisdictions. Even more jurisdictions were presented during the Commission hearing, and they were all lower than BC Hydro's projections. And the Commission was not able to produce an entirely new load forecast. It simply was not the time available. So they had to review the factors that lead to increased demand and lead to decreased demand. And they found that BC Hydro's mid-load forecast was excessively optimistic and considered it more appropriate to use the low-load forecast in making their determinations. And they raised the concern that the low-load forecast may in fact be too high. One of the reasons for that is something known as price elasticity. And what that means that is, in the case of electricity, is that as the electricity price increases, as will continue to be the case in British Columbia, at least till 2024 and very likely beyond, the demand for electricity decreases. And this makes intuitive sense. When option A becomes more expensive, we either choose less of option A or we choose another option, such as option B. So the Commission found that the long-run elasticity, so the long-run effect of increasing prices, the elasticity is too low. So the effect is going to be greater than, on the demand than BC Hydro has projected. And there will be considerable upward pressure on rates, as I mentioned. And there's a real risk of, in the Commission's view, of demand destruction. That the real rate increases will have very adverse effects on already vulnerable industrial customers. And when industry scales back or leaves the province, rates must increase further to make up for the lost consumption. Considering the very low natural gas prices that we currently have and increasing electricity prices, some sectors, such as space and water heating, are unlikely to electrify in the near future or entirely. BC Hydro acknowledges that though the direction is clear, the extent and timing of electrification is highly uncertain. Given this uncertainty, the Commission found that additional load requirements from potential electrification should not be included in BC Hydro's load forecast. But there are some important caveats in their report. They said that if electrification is higher or does occur to a greater extent than the Commission anticipates, some of that could be offset with additional demand-side management, bringing forward more resources to meet that demand, etc. And this clarification is important because BC Hydro has not implemented all cost-effective energy conservation for at least the past 5 years and has substantially reduced future investments. There is considerable conservation potential available. In terms of the alternative portfolios, the UBC, our reports and submissions presented alternative portfolios, so collections of resources, not including Site C, that met forecast needs under the low, the medium, and the high scenarios at lower cost than Site C, or lower cost than portfolios, including Site C. BC Hydro also presented an alternative portfolio without Site C, based on wind and pump storage hydroelectric. The Commission presented its own alternative portfolios, and they based these on their assessment that far less new energy and capacity would be needed than was forecasted by BC Hydro, as I mentioned. Our research found also that without Site C termination costs, which were estimated over a range, but at the end, the Commission settled on a number of $1.8 billion for advice purposes. Without those, the alternative portfolios would be far less costly than continuing with Site C. In the do-over case, so if we could turn back time, where Site C had never been initiated, it would clearly be uneconomic compared to the alternatives. Employment. The Program on Water Governance was the only intervener in the inquiry to present an employment analysis. And our methodology was fairly straightforward. We looked at the period from 2018 to 2090, which is the economic life of Site C. We ignore the sunk employment, so employment that's already happened from Site C, because it's common regardless of the future course of action. And we conservatively used a low load forecast for electricity growth in the employment estimates for the alternatives. We included employment from Site C remediation in the alternative portfolios because a decision to terminate Site C would trigger that employment. And we summed the employment based on the year-by-year resource additions under each scenario. So if a wind project was brought on, we brought on the employment associated with the construction or the operation of that wind project. And we used BC Hydro data. We did not create new employment data. So here's our findings summarized in a graph. The blue line here is the BCUC alternative. It creates a lot of employment. And the reason for that is because it's heavily dependent on conservation. And conservation creates the most employment per dollar spent. The red is the BC Hydro portfolio. It creates less employment. It's very wind dependent, which creates more employment than Site C, but not as much as the BCUC portfolio. The Site C portfolio, on the other hand, creates a lot of employment in the short term. But in the long term, it creates almost no employment. And this is because large-scale hydroelectric projects require very little labor, very limited labor in order to operate. In the absence of Site C, long-term employment would likely fall somewhere in this area here, in between the Commission's alternative and BC Hydro's alternative. And the reason for that is because the actual amount of conservation is likely to be less than the Commission thinks and more than BC Hydro thinks. So terminating Site C and pursuing the alternatives results in meaningful job losses in the short term. Some, but not all of this, can be transitioned. In the long term, the alternative portfolios outperform Site C for job creation. These jobs result from, as I said, remediation, energy conservation, and new wind and capacity resources. Alternative energy and energy conservation generate more jobs per dollar than spending on large hydro such as Site C. Greenhouse gas emissions. The Site C emissions from construction and embedded emissions are minimal compared to operations emissions. As a result, we did not consider them in our analysis. The operations emissions result from methane being released as a result of decomposition of biomass. And BC Hydro estimated these. We did not re-estimate them. We took BC Hydro's estimates. And they were 4.3 to 5.8 million tons over the 100-year life of the project. We also considered exports. The surplus energy from Site C could be exported and could reduce emissions in another jurisdiction. We estimated what those might be. And then we looked at the alternative portfolio as well. And we found that the construction and embedded emissions are similar and likely less than Site C. You don't have to move as much earth around. And the alternative portfolios consist entirely of clean resources. So they don't have any GHG emissions during their operations. And since they don't produce a large surplus, we didn't consider any export benefits from the alternative portfolios. So we found that Site C increases emissions even after export, 0.6 to 2.1 million tons over its 100-year lifetime, even after considering exports. And these emissions are equivalent to 50,000 automobiles for 10 years. So they really are quite modest relative to the energy produced during the life of the project, but they're not zero. The alternative portfolios, on the other hand, do not they have lower emissions than Site C, and they do not produce any emissions during their operations. Significant adverse environmental effects. So the joint review panel that reviewed Site C found that the project would have many significant adverse environmental effects. Our review showed that these effects exceeded those of any other project assessed during the history of the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. You can see in the table here, there's Site C. There's another large-scale hydroelectric project, the Lower Churchill project in Labrador. There are a few mines. There's also some oil sands projects there as well, at the Jacobon oil sands mine expansion, for example. There's the LNG facilities as well. This unprecedented level of effects results from the Peace River Valley's biodiversity and importance to First Nations land use and culture. And I might add that some of these projects were approved and others were not approved on the basis of their significant adverse environmental effects. So the alternative portfolio, those portfolios are unlikely to have significant adverse environmental effects. And the reason that we can say that with confidence, even though we don't know the specific projects that might be included in those portfolios, is that there's a lot of spatial flexibility in wind and geothermal projects, and there's a lot of potential projects. And this flexibility allows them to be designed and located so as to avoid potential significant adverse environmental effects. In addition, there are cost-effective, technically feasible, and proven mitigation measures to further minimize these effects. So to summarize, Site C is the more expensive option based on our analyses, with the potential for further cost overruns. Load growth could be lower than forecast, further eroding the financial viability. However, price elasticity and low carbon electrification are important factors influencing future electricity requirements. In terms of employment, terminating Site C and pursuing the alternatives results in job losses in the short term, not all of which can be transitioned. In the long term, the alternative portfolios outperform Site C for job creation. In terms of climate change, GHG emissions, Site C generates greenhouse gas emissions, which can't be entirely offset by exports. And these emissions exceed those of the alternative portfolios. Finally, Site C has more significant adverse environmental effects than any project ever assessed under the SEA. Thank you for your time and attention this evening.
Well, I want to thank Rick Hendricks for joining us from Toronto on very short notice. He sure had his research, his ducks in a row there. Now this brings us to our third presentation tonight by Dr. Gordon Christie. Dr. Gordon Christie has taught in universities in Canada and the United States, in faculties of law and departments of philosophy and Indigenous studies, including assistant professor at Osgoode Hall Law School, 1998 to 2004, where he also acted as director of the intensive program in Aboriginal lands, resources, and governments. Dr. Christie's research fields include Aboriginal legal issues, legal theory, and tort. His ancestry is, and I hope I pronounce it correctly, is Inupiat and Inuvialuit. Correct? You can come up, Dr. Christie, and clarify it. Thank you.
Do I need to click this, or? Should be good. Yeah, you just click on it. Just click on this anywhere, and it goes? Okay, good. Well, I'd like to thank the Peter Wall Institute and the Royal Society for hosting this event and having us all here to listen to these interesting discussions about economics and environmental impacts and climate change and so on. But now we're going to shift to a somewhat different discussion about the Site C Dam. One that is, in a way, I think, still quite pressing. I know Mark was saying he's focused more on Trans Mountain at this point, but there are things going on around Site C that are still quite lively, and I'm going to be talking about those. So I'm going to expose you to a fair amount of law, surprisingly. And I suspect you might want to take notes, because if you do well in the quiz at the end, apparently you get admission to the Royal Society, so it's good. So what I'm going to do is I should keep track of time, 20 minutes. This is quite a bit to go through. It's a fairly complicated matter when you bring treaty rights into the issue. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about Treaty 8. I'm going to talk a bit about the process for treaty making in Canada historically, what Canadian law says about treaties and treaty rights. And then I'm going to focus on Site C and what's been going on the last 10 years or so around Site C. So that's the wild trip we're going to take the next 20 minutes. It's going to be quite complicated, so bear with me. If you have any questions, of course, you can ask me about these things afterwards. So let's go to a map. This is from 1900, well, somewhere around 1900 or so. So it's an old map. It's not terribly accurate, but this is the area covered by Treaty 8. And it was entered into in 1899/1900 and includes a large part of northern Alberta and a little bit of the southern Northwest Territories, that part of the 60th parallel over there to the right. But if you can see this line here, that's the line between Alberta and BC. So you see that there's a large piece of the northeastern part of the province that actually was included in Treaty 8. And there's quite a story about this, but I don't have time for that story, so we're not going to get into how it is that British Columbia happened to have a historic treaty on part of it, because as you're probably all familiar with this fact, BC, for the most part, doesn't have any treaties, but that's the one large part of BC that has a significant historic treaty, other than some numbered treaties in the southern part of Vancouver Island and one in the north part. So I'm going to say a little bit about the treaty-making process. This began in really around 1849, 1850 in Ontario. There were earlier treaties in the East Coast and in Quebec, but in southern Ontario. But the larger treaties began around central Ontario and came out west, and they tended to track settlement and exploitation of resources and the development of a railroad. I'm going to say a little bit about all the different things that go into the process, and I can't really partition this talk very cleanly. I'm going to try and avoid talking about Canadian law for a minute, but I can't entirely, because these are important things that go into legal analysis. So obviously the parties to these treaties had very different things in mind, very different motives, very different intentions, and it's good to keep those in mind. And in a minute I'm going to talk about what Canadian law says about these treaties, and for the most part I'm going to try and stick to just information that would be useful for you to think about these things, but at other times I'm going to have to step back and say that there are obviously very big problems around how Canadian law treats treaties. Federal provincial complications, that's the thing I just mentioned earlier. It'd be interesting to get into this, because it is an odd thing that we have a historic treaty covering part of British Columbia. Really the short answer to this question of how this came to be is that BC found it in its interest to ignore what was going on in the northeast part of the province in 1899 and just let this treaty happen. The position in British Columbia up until the early 1990s was that Aboriginal people in the province had no rights of any significant import. It was only in the election of the NDP in 91, 92 that the province changed its position. So it didn't really think it had to get into treaties up until 1991, 92 or so. Okay, the negotiations are important because the text of the treaty is not treated as the only thing of import when it comes to Canadian law. Canadian courts look at the negotiations leading up to the treaty, and they pay attention to these to see what the promises were that were made. And that's where I'm going to go next. I'm going to look at what the negotiations include in terms of promises made by the Crown. And then subsequent activities are also looked at by courts to see, what the treaty really meant. I'm going to focus, when we're talking about Site C, the important part of Treaty 8 is this one provision here. So let me just read it out. So in Her Majesty the Queen hereby agrees with the said Indians that they shall have right to pursue the usual vocations of hunting, trapping, and fishing throughout the tracts surrendered as heretofore described, subject to such regulations as may from time to time be made by the government of the country, acting under the authority of Her Majesty, and this is the important part, saving and accepting such tracts as may be required or taken up from time to time for settlement, lumbering, mining, lumbering, trading, or other purposes. And this is known as the taking up clause, and it plays a centrally important part in the litigation around Site C. Now, as I mentioned, the negotiations around Treaty 8 are very important to pay attention to, and here's some bits and pieces of that. The negotiators on the Crown side kept very good notes, and they actually prepared reports, and these end up going into litigation nowadays because they show what the Crown was saying to First Nations as they were considering getting to a treaty. So Clifford Sifton, the commissioner for Treaty 8, said there was expressed at every point the fear that the making of the treaty would be followed by the curtailment of the hunting and fishing privileges. I put the second part in here just out of interest. That's about residential schools. Just don't need it. Continuing on, another part of the report says, we pointed out the government could not undertake to maintain Indians in idleness, that the same means of earning a livelihood would continue after the treaty was as existed before it, and the Indians would be expected to make use of them. So these are things being expressed to the First Nations in 1899 in this area of British Columbia. They would be expected to continue to hunt and fish. That would be their economy. This would be what would be necessary so the government wouldn't be saddled with costs. They were trying to avoid costs, and so they were promising to the treaty nations that they would be able to continue their hunting and fishing and trapping as before. So it was in the Crown's interest to make these promises. And finally, the chief difficulty was the apprehension that hunting and fishing privileges would be curtailed. And they go on to say that there were different arguments made that convinced the treaty nations that, in fact, or the First Nations, that this wouldn't be the case, that they'd be expected to be hunting and fishing as before. And then summarizing all this here, we had to solemnly assure them that, this is the underlying part, they would be as free to hunt and fish after the treaty as they would be if they'd never entered into it. So keep that in mind. That's a promise made in Treaty 8. We assured them that the treaty would not lead to any forced interference with their mode of life. So now, I'm just going to shift gears a little bit and just talk about the nature of treaties. What are these things? And there are lots of possibilities out there. I just listed a few of them. You could think of these as contracts. You could think of these as international agreements. The Royal Commission of Aboriginal Peoples looked at two different models for thinking of treaties, the marriage model and the divorce model. It's kind of interesting. There's a question about whether they're legally binding or whether they're merely political or moral. Now that's actually an interesting point to consider because between around 1920 and the mid-1960s, the position of all the Canadian governments, federal and provincial governments, was that these treaties were merely political or just sort of empty moral promises, and there was no legal substance to them. It was only in the mid-1960s when Canadian courts began to realize that actually these were in some form or other legally binding. Are they constitutional? I leave a couple of possibilities there. Are they actually constitutional documents like the Constitution Act of 1867 or 1982? Or are they constitutionally binding, although they themselves are not constitutional documents, or something else? And these are all just possibilities. What I want to do now is shift to what Canadian courts have been saying since the 1960s. This really picked up steam in the 1980s and 90s after Section 35 came to the Constitution Act. So we know from Canadian courts, and I got to pause here. I'm going to come to this point in just a minute or two, but as soon as I say that, I'm required by my conscience to say that this is Canadian law, and there's a question there as to why Canadian law determines all these things. Why did Canadian courts make all these determinations when these are agreements between the Crown and Indigenous peoples? There are two legal systems at play, but somehow Canadian law comes to play this important role. Okay, so Canadian courts say these are not mere contracts, but they're also not international in scope. They're not international in terms of their status. And they are seen as being absolute surrender. So the model is of First Nations giving up everything at the moment they sign the treaty. Everything is given up, and then in exchange they get a new set of rights. And that's the extinguishment model that you might have heard about that is so commonly fought by First Nations across the province. It's still the basic model in play in the modern treaty process in this province, and First Nations do not like that model. It's legally binding, Treaty 8 is, historic treaties are generally, principally because of courts' decisions in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, but now, after 1982, these treaties are recognized in the Constitution. So we have Section 35, the treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada hereby recognized and affirmed. This is a bit of a race to get through all this, sorry, but now we have to look at what courts have been saying about how these treaties are dealt with. So this is the jurisprudence on treaty rights. So we have a very complicated set of rules built up, and normally I'd spend a class or two in a first-year class in Aboriginal treaty rights explaining this. I'm just going to skim over this very quickly. Sorry about that, but that's what has to happen. Courts have been saying since 1999 in the Marshall decision that Canadian governments can act within the treaty. So think back to the taking up clause. They can exercise that right to take up without having to do anything. They just take up. It's part of what the treaty gave them the power to do, right? So there's that part of treaties. On top of that, they can also infringe treaty rights. That's different from that. That's extending their power beyond that. And given the time constraints, I'm going to probably move back and forth a little bit. I'm going to go into this mode of critiquing what's going on here. That's very strange. If you've never thought of that before, give it some thought. If you have a mortgage with the bank, if you have a car loan or something, do you have the ability to decide, oh, I don't like this, I'm just going to change the agreement. I'm just going to, on my own, just going to change it. That's a power the Canadian governments have. They can unilaterally alter the terms of the treaties. Okay? Now, that's infringement. Now, what that means in Canadian law is they have to act according to the Constitution Act, and the Canadian courts have set out a test for them to meet. And that's what you hear in the news a lot. There's this question about infringement. The next question is about whether the Crown can justify infringement. And the test itself is a two-stage test. The Crown would have to demonstrate it has a sufficiently compelling substantial objective. If it has that, then under that objective, it has to show that it's met what are called its fiduciary obligations. Okay, and being a fiduciary, basically you recognize that the Crown has all the power. That's what it is to be a fiduciary. If you're a fiduciary, like a trustee, you have control of somebody's estate, you have all the power. And the party whose estate you have control over just has to trust that you're going to act well. That's the situation the Crown is in with First Nations. They have all the power, so they're the fiduciary, and then they have to exercise their fiduciary obligations according to legal requirements, which means they're actually supposed to act in the interests of the beneficiaries, the other side of the relationship. But we'll see that also gets twisted in the courts. Now, what's been added on top of this is this notion that, as well as all of these requirements, the treaties themselves bring to the surface this notion of the honor of the Crown. So even if the Crown is exercising a power it has within the treaty, remember that's something you can do when it takes up land, for example, it has to do it exercising this power in a way that fulfills its honor. And that's where the duty to consult comes in, that you've probably heard so much about. This has been an industry for lawyers in this province. I mean, it has probably allowed the real estate market in this city to keep its high levels because, you know, hundreds of lawyers are making a living off of this in this province. Well, this is the interlude I promised earlier. I've already skipped into this because I can't stop myself. There are just so many problems with this model when you step back from it, think about it a little bit. there's a tremendous asymmetry here. There's the exercise of power in ways that is really very questionable. I'm just going to go to the last part down here and just note that if you trace this back, how do we get here? All of this comes from some explicitly racist doctrine. This is not something I'm trying to foist on you. I'm trying to make you think this way. There's no way you can question that these doctrines are racist. The doctrine of discovery basically allows for European powers to take over lands that they discover that are already inhabited, so long as those other people living there are not Christian and they're not civilized, and there are all these markers that they bring in. This is as explicitly racist as you can imagine, right? If you want an example of racism, be good to talk about the doctrine of discovery. And this is at the heart of Canadian jurisprudence. All Canadian law is built on that. There's a focal point at the bottom, there's a tiny little point at the base of Canadian law. That's it. That explains why Canadian courts deal with these issues. That explains why they're dealt with this way, why the Crown has the power it does. It's all because of this racist underpinning. So now, I've got 5 minutes left to do Site C. Okay, but I think I can go pretty quickly here. I'm just going to skip through the jurisprudence because there's a lot going on in the last couple of years. There have been challenges. I'm going to skip through the Joint Review Panel business. You're probably all familiar with this. One thing that was very strange was that well, not strange really, if you knew anything about Christy Clark, but there was no allowance made within the Joint Review Panel for there to be a look into treaty rights, into their infringement. I was explicitly excluded. Now, this is a very, text-dense passage, but I'm just going to summarize it. What Canadian courts have been trying to do in the last 3 or 4 years is push all of the questions about Site C into consultation. Everything is about consultation, because really, what is consultation? It's just a process. You just need to set up some situations where people talk. That's how consultation is. First Nations come to a place, the Crown listens. As long as the Crown, seriously listens, like, oh yeah, we're listening, yes. They've succeeded, right? So that's what's been going on the last 3 or 4 years. And the difficult thing for the courts and the governments has been to push it all into consultation because the First Nations have been arguing from day one, this is about treaty infringement. This is about a dam being built that's going to infringe upon their rights under Treaty 8, right? So the litigation that began a few years ago with Prophet River First Nation and West Mobley First Nation, they were challenging a decision of the Governor and Council. They wanted to look into this taking up provision, and they wanted to ask questions about that. When is taking up too much? When does taking up become infringement? At what point do you take up so much land that the exercise of the treaty rights on the other side is made impossible or difficult to some extent, so you say that there's infringement? And the second thing that's tied into that, there's a significant overlap, is this notion of cumulative effects. Because there's been so much industrial development in this area, so much, that at some point this massive industrial development means that the next thing that happens is just too much. So they want cumulative effects to be looked at. I'm just going to try and summarize this pretty quickly here. The Governor and Council decision was that while there would be adverse effects on Aboriginal people's use of land and resources, these would be justified in the circumstances. 2014 decision. They didn't offer any reasons for that. They just said, well, we've looked at everything, we think it's all justified. This is the more technical side of things. The result's the important part, right down here. The result of these decisions, there were 2 decisions, Federal Court of Appeal and the BC Court of Appeal, because there were 2 bodies making decisions about this. There was the federal government giving permits, the provincial government giving permits, so they both were challenged in their separate respective court systems. And both courts agreed that what happened was, quote unquote, reasonable, and all of that without any look at treaty infringement. There's been no direct examination of treaty infringement. Everything was pushed into consultation, and both courts agreed there was sufficient consultation. So what about taking up? Well, we have case law on taking up. This is from 2014, Grassy Narrows case. And we know that if taking up leaves a treaty nation, this is out in northwestern Ontario, eastern Manitoba, if the taking up leaves a treaty nation with no meaningful right to hunt, fish, or trap in relation to territory which had traditionally hunted, fished, and trapped, a potential action for treaty infringement will arise. And what the courts have said around the Site C is if the First Nations really think that there's been treaty infringement, they need to have a separate direct action initiated on this. What about cumulative effects? There's no real case law on this yet. There's a case going through right now which is going to push this to the Supreme Court of Canada, but we're looking then probably at 3, 4, 5 years in the future when the Supreme Court gets a chance to look at this. There's a case from a First Nation up in the treated area, the Blueberry River First Nation. And let me just give you a sense of what they're arguing about. This is their traditional territory. They're one of the First Nations up in the Treaty 8 area. This isn't all of Treaty 8. This is just their traditional territory. And this is what's been going on since the mid-60s. And this is their, you can see they're making arguments about cumulative effects because there's not much left there. A study done by the Suzuki Foundation found that if you drop yourself down at any particular point in the Blueberry River traditional territory, there'd be a 73% chance that within 250 meters there'd be some industrial activity, right? So that's how they're making a cumulative effects kind of argument on the basis of these kinds of situations. Now, because these other cases all got pushed into consultation, the West Mobley First Nation has had to start a direct treaty infringement case, and they began that in January. I gave a couple of pieces of this here in the overhead, but I don't have time to go through this. I'm down to like 90 seconds, like that. But basically, they're arguing that they can no longer exercise their treaty rights. They can't meaningfully exercise them anymore, given all the stuff that's going on. The 2 dams that already have flooded most of the valley, right? This third one will pretty much finish the job. And all the other activity, the fracking, the oil and gas, all that stuff up there. So these are the arguments they're making. They're making arguments about taking up going too far and about cumulative effects. Now, along the way, what they want to do is they want to stop Site C. This is what I meant when I said that things are so live up there. This isn't a done deal. Right? They're asking for an injunctive relief, which means they want to have an injunction issued by the courts in BC to stop the building of the dam until these other matters are dealt with. You can't build a dam until you settle these legal questions. Unfortunately, injunctive actions have been very difficult for First Nations to succeed under since around the early 90s. It looks like many of you in the room are probably old enough to remember Clayoquot Sound, all that kind of stuff, Mears Island. Back in those days, First Nations were getting injunctions, and the courts woke up and realized that wasn't good for the economy in the province. And so now, when it comes to these arguments about injunctions, courts almost always say that the economy is more important than First Nations interests. So we'll wait to see how this goes. It'll be heard this summer. So we'll know in the middle of summer about this, but I don't give it a lot of, I wish it would go a different way, but likely. Okay, so this is really it. Maybe I did the end. So this is a summary here. So we have constitutionally protected rights that are nearly entirely ineffectual. I hear people all the time talking about how First Nations have this power to do this and that, and they win cases and so on. But it doesn't seem to match with the reality of the situation. It's very difficult for treaty rights to actually get anything accomplished. The Crown power is nearly entirely unfettered. These solemn and sacred agreements are actually treated less weighty than contracts. You can't take a contract and imagine one party has the power to just change the terms. So in many ways, treaties themselves are treated as less important or less weighty than contracts. And all of this is on a base of racism and colonialism. And I was expected to talk today about, why Canadians should worry about this. Well, you're the treaty parties on the other side. Assuming everybody in this room is Canadian, maybe some of you are national students, I don't know. But if you're Canadian, you're the other side of the agreement. There's the First Nations, and you're the other party. So it's your responsibility as treaty nations, treaty partners. You're part of a treaty nation, Canada. Canada's a treaty nation. And you're treaty rights holders. And it's your responsibility to pay attention to these matters, because you've gained all the benefit from these treaties. And if you gained all the benefit, then really you have to start thinking about your responsibilities, the flip side of that. So thank you.
Thanks, Gordon. So if I could have the 2 panelists, Mark Jackard and Gordon Christie, sit up here, and we'll take some questions from the audience, and also over people watching on Facebook can submit questions at hashtag AskSiteC over Twitter. So if there's anyone who would like to start with any questions, yes, I'll start with you And if you could keep the questions concise and make them questions, we'll get through more in the time. Thank you.
So I'm not going to make a speech, I just have a question. How much of the information that we heard tonight do you think John Horgan and his cabinet knew? And he presented facts and philosophy, but one thing he didn't mention was politics. So help me understand how much was known and what you think were the major factors that led to his decision.
You're asking me first, or?
Well, either one of you.
Do you want to? Okay. Yeah. So I was just trying to remember what the NDP campaigned in that election on. Maybe someone can. I think it was that we will look into the site. We will do a hearing, or we will send the Site C review to the Utilities Commission if we're elected. And then I don't know if they said it during the election campaign, but they wrote terms of reference, which were, we will decide, continue, or cancel, looking at the economics of it. How costly or not costly would either of those decisions be? So I'm happy to be corrected by someone, but it was something like that. And so that's why I just wanted people to be aware that I just heard a lot in the media, and Andrew Weaver said this a lot as well, who's a good friend of mine, but Andrew Weaver kept saying, you see, the Utilities Commission has shown and proven that it's that it's cheaper for British Columbia, so it's just economics, not about rights of different groups or anything, it's cheaper to cancel, cheaper to continue the project. And so, you know, on what motivated John Horgan's and the cabinet's decision, I have no idea. I wasn't in the room, seriously, I don't know. But I do know, and I just, when I was listening to the presentation of Rick Hendricks, and he was just talking about the economics and what the Utilities Commission agreed on, the Utilities Commission admitted to a whole bunch of mistakes afterwards. So you might not all be aware of that. Marvin Schaefer, who has been a long-time energy economist in BC like me, we fought and agreed on various things. He has, like me, been opposed to the Site C dam, and he wrote a very good blog, I think, a very succinct one-page blog at the end when he summarized that then the government and BC Hydro said, oh, Utilities Commission, you forgot to figure out the cost this way. And the Utilities Commission admitted a whole bunch of cost errors. So I do know that the cabinet would have seen from its own staff, I can't find it now, but they would have seen, for example, that BCUC recognized errors in its calculations that would have made it a $300 million difference, being more expensive to cancel the project. And I was amazed that Andrew Weaver would never mention that. And then actually the way in which they paid off, they would say, how do we pay it off through ratepayers and so on, ended up to be a $900 million difference. And that's not including the things I pointed out about assumptions that the BCUC assumed that we would do nothing about greenhouse gas reduction. So I think the provincial, Horgan's government would have been looking at almost $1 billion difference in the two. Now that's assuming that Site C didn't cost more than like 10.7 billion. If it ends up costing 14 billion or whatever, then that gets blown out of the water. So I'm not talking about that uncertainty, and I know the cabinet would have tried to figure that out as well. So I think those would have been the factors economically in terms of their terms of reference that they would have looked at. All of their political calculus, no idea.
Now, with the questions, I'm going to ask people to come up to the mic, so then it will be recorded on the Facebook and in the video. So if you have questions, you're welcome to come up to the mic. In the meantime, I'll ask one of the questions that's come over the Twitter. It says, thank you, Mark Jackard, for your insightful talk. How inexpensive does battery storage have to become before California will stop buying electricity from BC?
So I mean, to stop buying electricity from BC for the facilities we've already built, it would have to get capacity from us, it would have to be incredibly cheap. But for us to say, let's go out and build a new site, starting from scratch, a new site C, again, it's hard to say, but I would still be very careful to assume that batteries are going to do this all. So I have been in the energy industry long enough to see a lot of what I call hype cycles, whether it was hydrogen and the fuel cell and how cheap it was going to get, and even how cheap nuclear was going to get a long time ago. So with batteries, I have that same kind of care. It's very uncertain compared to Site C's capacity.
Okay, and now our next question.
Thank you, both of you, for the talks. I was wondering, just one quick comment, if I may. Those of us who are watching the court case, there's going to be a website coming up very soon called witnessforthepeace.ca. And if anybody's interested in finding out about that, please sign up. I've got a sign-up sheet about that. My question is around the racism of the courts in particular, because I think there's systemic racism that we've seen recently around the decisions around Colton Bushey, Tina Fontaine, and I'm wondering about what we can do as Canadians to hold hold the courts accountable, because they're supposed to be impartial. So I do think it's worth paying attention and tweeting about it and getting involved in watching the case and analyzing it. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and whether that changes anything in terms of the situation that we're in. Because this was the government that said it was going to implement this, right? This was in all those mandate letters that cabinet ministers got and all of that. And this decision has unfortunately made a mockery of that promise.
Gordon, do you want to take that one on?
I think it may be for me. Yeah. I was trying to imagine how much I could fit into 20 minutes, and I would have liked to say something about the UN Declaration, but it would have taken more than just a couple of extra minutes. The short of it is that we don't know what the impact of the UNDRIP is going to be, because we've had both the federal and provincial governments talk about implementing it, but we haven't seen it actually happen yet. And I know they both have in the back of their minds some attempt to domesticate the UNDRIP. They're going to take this international instrument, and the federal government has certainly signaled that they mean to put it into Canada in a way that fits with what already exists in terms of the jurisprudence. So somehow, and I don't know how they're going to do this exactly, they're going to try and take all the stuff I showed you in the middle of my talk about consultation and how treaties are dealt with. That's already established jurisprudence, and they're going to try and fit UNDRIP into that. And that's quite a magic trick, because they're completely different in their outlook on things. The basis for UNDRIP is to account for the racism and colonialism that has led us to this point, whereas the jurisprudence is built on racism and colonialism. So I don't know how that's going to work, other than I think that they're going to try and do some sort of smoke and mirrors kind of game and have it look as though UNDRIP's been implemented. And I'm looking forward to seeing how they do this magic trick.
Okay, our next question on the right, the former MLA for Vancouver Point Grey, Tom Perry.
I'd just like to thank Professor Christie. I thought that was remarkably lucid exposition, which I don't think I've ever heard before. And that was worth there. Not that the other presentations weren't good, but it was worth coming here for that alone tonight. And I have a question for Mark Jaccard. Having served briefly in a cabinet, I have less faith in you that the decisions are based on accurate information. My profession in medicine is very much like Professor Christie's, and usually we learn in retrospect that we got it almost always wrong in medicine, just like the courts. But I think the cabinet is very similar. It's unusual that decisions are made in any cabinet, as far as I can see, globally, that are usually wise the first time around. But since you're not afraid of controversial questions, do you think the NDP government made its decision before the meetings in which you and others participated in briefing, or after that?
I think they made it after. I think there was some real division in that cabinet. And I can't say more than that. Some real division. And also, though, the cabinet was very nervous about where it could get information. And so it ended up going to the Utilities Commission, which, it kind of had committed to that. I do remember that in past governments, when I took over the Utilities Commission, I actually had to change a lot of staff and get a lot of retraining happening. I don't know where the commission had been at during the period of Christy Clark and a long period like that. I did know that there were some deputy ministers in government that had been around for a very long time. Les McLaren, and there's some other names that I would mention who I know are really good and really independent. So one of the things I said in that cabinet meeting is I said, pay attention to what your staff are telling you. There's a really interesting back and forth right now going on between your staff, Hydro, and the Utilities Commission, and the story is changing. And that's what I just tried to convey to you, or Marvin Schaefer summarized some of that very well. So at the end of the day, I can't tell you if they decided ahead of time, but I got a strong sense from various parties that there was a real pitched battle going on in there. Again, some people, a lot of them not knowing a lot of things and having preconceived notions about whether they should move ahead with this or not.
We don't have a lot of time, so I'd like to get as many questions as possible. So the next gentleman.
Yes. Good afternoon or good evening. My name is Mauro Chiesa. I'm a graduate of UBC, but I worked in New York and in Washington with hydro projects, about 10 overall my lifetime. This is the first project I've seen where there's been no dam safety review. And this project is being built on shale and in an area where there is fracking, so there is going to be some seismic activity. And I have seen no report. There is no report.
So do you have a question?
Have you seen such report?
So I have not comprehensively reviewed any aspects of the Site C Dam other than the things I talked about. And so I come to you as an expert in those three areas, not an expert on the Site C Dam, on legal rights, on safety review. I mean, I am aware, as you are, that that engineering is a profession that has rules of professional conduct and practice, and that large corporations, especially publicly owned ones, are actually very risk averse. But in the particular case you're talking about, I don't know if you're right or wrong.
No,
Okay.
There is no report.
Okay, fair enough.
Well,
Thank you.
Actually,
you made
I'm
your
going
point.
to I'm going to hold that in abeyance. There may be some kind of report that someone says, but I'll take your word for it for now.
Next question. Thanks.
My name is Dr. Finn. I'm a retired partner of KPMG. I have a question for Dr. Jacquard. In your excellent summary there, Dr. Jacquard, you mentioned that dispatchability was a big factor in deciding to have Site C. I have a couple of questions. And you also said that as the use of alternative power like solar and wind goes up, so does the price of dispatchable. But that runs contrary to the evidence from the place where BC Hydro sells its energy, the Mid-Columbian Hub, whose prices deteriorated from about $51 a megawatt hour down to $28 in the last 10 years.
And your question?
My question is, given that BC Hydro's estimated cost for Site C is about $120 a megawatt hour, does it make any sense for BC Hydro to be making power and selling it at $28 in the United States?
I guess I'm taking this one. Yeah. No, you take it. Yeah. And that's one of the things that I and others had to explain. And I think the one reference I had on one of my slides there was Bisline, and that's work with Jeff Blanford and Paul Joskow at MIT and a lot of leading scholars who were saying that our system of pricing right now has not caught up with what the real value is for dispatchables and non-dispatchables. And so the prices on short run at hubs right now are not an indication of where the prices are going to go. And that's why in my evidence to the Utilities Commission, I do explain the system modeling that has led the leading experts to say, oh my goodness, the dispatchable value is going to have to go way up. And so and I'm a reviewer for a couple of the leading journals, and so I'm spending a lot of time reading submissions to journals which look at different experiments that are feeding into the government of the UK and reforms they made. I'm just looking at and looking at different Denmark, different jurisdictions, and where they see that price going. And that's what I was talking about. So as you get more and more of that wind into the system, I was showing you a diagram that went way beyond the amount of wind you have in these systems right now. Although Denmark has started to show some of those very kinds of values that I'm talking about.
I would counter that Denmark does not have the largest source of dispatchable power that BC does in its dams, which can be considered as the battery of all batteries. And
yes, so that's nothing to do with what I'm saying. I'm just telling you that in North America, that the value of the existing BC hydro dams and anything that's dispatchable is likely to go up significantly. That's what the leading thinkers are coming to right now, and I tried to explain to you why.
Okay, now I'm going to bring up the next questioner.
So thank you to all three of the presenters. Mark, I would just say that a lot of what I heard from you tonight is the same with what we've heard about global warming over the last 20 years. You know, there's argument for it, argument against it. I didn't hear you speak about the other dams that could have turbines attached to them, built into them, Burrard Thermal, all these other ways that we could deal with the dispatchability question. But really why I came here tonight was to listen to Gordon Christie, and I really appreciate your presentation. And I think that it's of primary interest to all of us in this room to understand that the West Moberly and the Prophet River and the entire association of Treaty 8 nations, as well as the Blueberry Nation, which are all the Indian bands that are in that area, are against this dam. And none of us in this room can say consent, reconciliation, Indigenous rights, or any of those things if we go ahead and commit cultural genocide and flood at least 2 or 3 nations off their land in 2018, period. So I think that's the only point that we're dealing with at this stage of the game. And the question I have for you, Mr. Christie, is my understanding of the honor of the Crown is also that the honor, they're required to be stewards of the land for which they are in charge of the treaties. And with, you know, I mean, Mount Pauli is outside, but there's so many ways in which the honor of the Crown has not maintained its responsibility to look after the land and water in the Treaty 8 territories. And could you make a comment on that?
Well, I'd be all in favor of the honor of the Crown going that far. It doesn't at this point in time in Canadian law. In Canadian law, the honor of the Crown only operates in this field of Aboriginal law, and it only operates as a way of measuring Crown activity. It's a funny thing because the courts say that they will presume the honor of the Crown, and my first-year students always sort of laugh at that because, you know, many of them are First Nation students, and because it's very funny to presume something that has rarely ever existed. But that's the presumption that the courts operate under. So they measure things by that. But the honor of the Crown only operates in this very small sphere, which is Aboriginal law in Canada. It'd be wonderful if the honor of the Crown also meant that the Crown was under these obligations to be stewards of the land, but that's for, you know, again, Canadians generally to try and have somehow come into being in this country.
Can I just clarify, stewards of the land to make sure that hunting, fishing, and trapping rights are maintained, which was what was promised in the treaty? Yeah,
in terms of the treaties, yeah, and the honor of the Crown applies to those, and that's the kind of thing that's going to come up in this particular case, right? The West Moberly case. But that case, I didn't get a chance to talk about that case very much because it just got going in January with a statement of claim, which means that we won't have a trial date set for probably a few more months, and then that'll take hundreds of days potentially because it's a very complicated matter. That's at the trial level. We'll have the BC Court of Appeal, we'll have the Supreme Court of Canada. We're not looking for a determination on these matters probably until 4 or 5 years from now, at which point, unless an injunction is successful, and the odds aren't that great for that, the dam will be built and the valley be flooded. So, and what happens is that the Crown knows that this is what's going to happen, and they're comfortable with that because there will be a likely finding of treaty infringement, which will mean the Crown shouldn't have done what it did. There may be some justification some measure of justification, but there'll be some point at which, in order to justify what they do, they're going to have to compensate the First Nations. And the figure that's being tossed around right now by the First Nations up there is around $1 billion, which is probably about right. And that's just going to get tacked on your hydro rates.
Okay, I'm going to take a question here from the Ask Site C with the hashtag. And this is from one of the landowners who's quite well known, Arlene Boone. And her question deals with dispatchability and says, bringing on more renewables will free up our reservoirs to provide our dispatchability for increased demand. Time of use billing will also help with that. I would like Mark Jackard to comment on that.
So that was the diagram that I showed that had two levels. One was the Utilities Commission's forecast of demand, and the other was its forecast of capacity. And I mean, I spoke more anecdotally about why it's difficult to ramp down demand by even more than PowerSmart is talking about right now. So I would just repeat that answer, which is that it's way more difficult than you might imagine, and there are places around the world where people have tried to do that. So we have more and more research that's showing, sort of applied research, whether it's in Italy or wherever, that's showing how costly that can be. So that's simply my answer.
Okay, next question from this gentleman.
I'm Matthew. I'm just a second-year art student. So my question is, how do both of your research sort of address the dynamics of like Canadian federalism, especially like for Site C or like thinking forward like other energy projects, or like the Trans Mountain Pipeline, like be it's about like how Alberta and the oil industry might affect demand for like electricity in the future, or like how the litigation is currently going on both the provincial and federal levels. Yeah, so how does Canadian federalism factor into the current situation?
I'll say a couple words and you can say them.
You're the legal expert.
I think Mark is wanting to jump into Trans Mountain, so that's where this is coming to the surface in an interesting way, because the courts in Canada have been saying for the last 10 years or so that we're in a new era of cooperative federalism. And I'm not sure exactly what they're looking at to see this, but that's what they've been thinking is happening in Canada. They've been using that notion to allow provinces to infringe upon treaties. It would have been questionable whether provinces had the power to infringe upon treaties under the old model of federalism. So they're actually, in this context, using cooperative federalism as a way to allow provinces to enjoy more power. Now, as a matter of fact, provinces and the federal governments have never been, cooperating in areas where their interests conflict, and we're seeing this in Trans Mountain. So I think we're going to probably have a bit of a bump in the road for that notion that they get along.
And I would just add to that, and again, this is me secondhand listening to lawyers, that in Canada, I've always felt anything on greenhouse gases, we should never call it an energy policy. People have called for a national energy policy. I mean, energy is really primarily the rights of the provinces. And when it comes to climate change, the federal government enters into international agreements, or I don't know what they're called legally, and then at least the lawyers that I've heard from, sort of a range of them, some of this through various institutes I've been involved with, and also some opinions that have been used for various government levels, that the federal government should stick to greenhouse gases and that it has the authority to regulate those. So what's been frustrating for me is I understand why Justin Trudeau tries to talk about cooperative federalism, and I'm going to give a pipeline to Alberta so they'll buy into the greenhouse gas reduction. But I say that's just not going to work, and it's not going to work because you've got I've seen it over 30 years. You get different governments. It could be Jason Kenney is the premier of Alberta a year from now, and he says, I'm not doing any of this stuff. The federal government is going to have to say we're regulating based on greenhouse gases. And the irony is, Stephen Harper, said, I can regulate based on greenhouse gases, and he put in a coal plant regulation right across the country, and he got away with it. And all Trudeau needs to do, and they're starting to do it, is turn the dial on that regulation. So I'm hoping the federal government sticks to greenhouse gases, and if it uses that criteria when it approves pipelines, that's where a lot of my work is now, you shouldn't be approving pipelines. You shouldn't be expanding fossil fuel infrastructure, because any kind of global model shows you that oil sands do not expand. They're high cost, high emission among the range of oil opportunities around the world, and they won't make it economically if humanity was trying to keep the temperature rise to 2 degrees or lower.
Okay, we're going to just have time for one more question, and I'm sorry for people who have been unable to get questions in, but we only have the room for a certain amount of time. Thank you.
Very quickly on two sort of points of factual, I think that are factual disagreement. First of all, when the NDP, I guess I'm a little less friendly towards the NDP's rationale. When they announced their decision to go ahead with Site C, they did not talk about the issues that you talked about at all. They talked about the credit rating that they thought was in problem, that they were going to have debt on the books. They gave political economic arguments, not ones that actually supported the process. The second point was that when the NDP ran on the election platform, they didn't just say they were going to send it to the BC utilities. In their platform, they said, we would rather do sustainable energy projects than flood farmland. That's code for, we're not going to go ahead with Site C. Anyway,
now the
they
question?
did. My question is, it's actually not on those questions, which is...
But just a minute, so you're saying the NDP didn't say they were going to put it to the Utilities Commission?
They did say that,
Yeah,
but in
okay,
addition
thanks.
to that, they said they weren't going to flood valuable
but obviously,
farmland.
if they're putting it to the Utilities Commission, they still intend
Yes.
to make a decision.
Yes, they did, yes. So my question is, I respect that both of you and the third person are wise and thoughtful and careful academics, but you are not just academics. You are, I assume, citizens, or you're full participants in this society. And when we talk about laws that are racist and colonialist, and that we are partners in that, we are settlers who are part of those treaties. My question to both of you is, what is your responsibility as people who live in this society as the other side of the treaty, and I'm asking you both, to actually to make decisions and to advocate for decisions that do not abrogate the traditional rights of Indigenous peoples in this country? What is your responsibility?
I like to leave it to you, but I'm going to say mine would be the same as I hope any other citizen, which is to listen carefully and be able to change my mind. So I was just taking notes like crazy, and I learned a lot. And some of it was a little different than what I thought I knew, or quite a bit of it, no, some of it. And it was also a little confusing, because there's, not your fault, there are real challenging issues. Like, okay, you lose in the courts. So when we lose in the courts, then we want to recognize, though, but that court system might be biased or is biased. So then what do we do about that, right? So as any citizen, I might then try to vote for governments that would try to correct that in some way. But as an academic, I've always believed that I help society best if I stick to what I know. And so finally, just to your point about the rationale that the NDP gave when they did announce it, the credit rating issue, I was stunned when I heard that, because that was certainly not part of a conversation that I'd heard before. And so maybe you're right. Maybe there was some kind of pull out of a hat political thing. I don't know. I'm just saying I was surprised by that too. So I do agree with you that it seemed bizarre.
Gordon?
Well, thank you for the question. Where'd she sit? Okay. I did pose it as a challenge to each of you, because I think that that's something that each of us has to grapple with. I think that, if each of us think this through, then we can decide on alliances, we can form partnerships, and we can gather our collective strength and do something about the situation. So, for example, the UNDRIP is a very interesting document. If you're not familiar with it, go online and read it. It's not that long, it's 5 or 10 pages, something like that. It's a real opportunity. If the UN Declaration was actually implemented the way it's meant to be understood, according to the drafters and the UN, that would change the landscape in Canada quite dramatically. So let's push for that. Let's try and hold the governments to their language, try and push them away from this idea of domesticating it and making it an actual instrument in Canada that has some effect on the ground. Otherwise, there are endless things that we can do, most of which is political. I want to go back to one of the earlier questions, though, because somebody was asking about sort of the politics of what was going on around the decision. And there's something that we can all, as Canadians, do to help the Treaty 8 First Nations. I'm pretty sure that the provincial government was doing the kinds of calculations all governments do. They're thinking about the next election, thinking about votes, and they think the Treaty 8 nations are made up of a couple thousand individuals. And they're like, it's not, we'll push off the compensation to taxpayers later on, and we'll get a black eye for this, but we're not really going to suffer politically. Well, that's something for us to do as Canadians, as people living in the province, try and join voices with the Treaty 8 nations. In terms of my outlook on things, it's kind of a funny panel to be on because, when it comes to the decisions between things like coal and natural gas and tar sands and dams, it's hard not to think, well, dams are better than those other evil things. But in this case, we can't put dams in places without thinking about the consent of the treaty nations, but thinking about the promises that were made to them in the treaties of which we're parties to. So we just need to think about these things.
That's wonderful, and thank you very much. And I'd like to thank Gordon Christie, Mark Jackard, and also Rick Hendricks from Toronto, Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies, and Walter Merida, and as well the Royal Society of Canada and the Pacific Chapter, and Graham Wynne, and the Tyee, which is one of the sponsors, as well as the Georgia Strait. There's an audience can answer, there's surveys for people in the room that you can fill in as you leave, or you can collect them. And then that will provide feedback to the two organizations that put it on. There's also Facebook audience feedback. You can go on Twitter and hashtag AskSiteC if you want to provide feedback. And I'll also close by saying there will be video archived on the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies website and the Facebook page, so you could watch the entire thing again. And because sometimes there was a lot of information that came forward. So thanks again, and I really appreciate y'all for coming out.